and I will pray for each and every one of you in your travels, in your families, and good health. And I also pray for people that are homeless, children that are in care, people that have addictions, because they all have a story. We all have a journey, and they too also have a journey. So I pray for those individuals, because that's what we are supposed to do, to take care of our community. My traditional name in my language is Ninjubinesikwe, which means Two Thunderbird Woman, and I am from the Bear Clan. And that is how we do our ceremonies, our gatherings, our events. So with that, I'm going to do my prayer in my language. Ninjubinesikwe ndigu makwantuute. Naminawa higmishi na mawana sema. Shibegagi sumakishemanito. Shishaweni migun. Shuabante gong minabimata siwe. And being on Quake in a Macaronic Nsiega Shikuan. Gave you not become out in every Martisian. I've been on Chica hot again, and been holding about that coat as what, she pleased to Manchu what. Me gave you on the Shibuka Center Hall. Chiminoya watch me come what him and be Martisian guy she can them. The China don't cool my beat to one dig to win. The Chinese Schnabek, my Koyok, Nibakani Boyar. Gave you on the Shinanakumak. Me kun the kinsi van egin taikidot. Mana cheba kanauya, wabskiek, pitek, mishinabek. Me ko egin taikidot. Kchinen daud showay gashi chigeng mga pusenga kin. Pagusen mi won, chimbegali sa mga kishamanito. Kata siya doon ko mesha pagusen naman. Mi wes ticket doon gagi ishigak. Kchinen da banchi di yan. I embrace you all, my friends. It's great to see you all here. And I wish you have a good learning session tonight, and thank you for being here. Nibach.
Thank you, Elder Nepanak. It's always a pleasure to have her here. She's always got such warm words to deliver, and what a respectful thing. The whole crowd stood up. We don't always see that, so that was very, very special of you to do that. I have the pleasure of inviting the Chief of Staff to the Lieutenant Governor to come forward to bring greetings on behalf of Her Honor. It is my great pleasure to welcome Kate Gamero to the dais.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Government House and our Reconciliation Through Education series. As George said, I'm Kate Gamero. I'm the Chief of Staff to Lieutenant Governor Anita Neville. Her Honor has asked that I pass along her most sincere regrets. She was very sad to have to miss this evening, but as George said, she's had something on the books for months, and try as we might, you can't always change things. On Her Honor's behalf, I would like to welcome back those of you who have joined us throughout the series. And to those who may be attending for the first time, thank you for coming out to be part of the discussion and for showing a willingness to learn and to listen to the messages being shared. Government House is situated in the heart of Treaty 1 territory and in the capital of a province that is the ancestral and present-day home of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, Nehoto Nation, Inuit, and Red River Métis. In being here this evening, each of you is acknowledging and honoring the importance of working together towards advancing understanding, healing, and reconciliation. And that is why these discussions with experts from the National Centre for Truth and Reconciliation, as well as the University of Manitoba, are so important, and why Her Honor and our entire team are so proud to partner with NCTR in this endeavor. As we near the end of this series, there's one more presentation on November 21st. We will continue to explore the life-altering impacts that residential schools had and continue to have on Indigenous culture. This series has provided a forum to ask questions, to learn some hard truths of what many generations have experienced, and to seek ways to continue to create the path forward. Conversations such as these provide insight to those societal impacts and focus on the need for all of us to come together to build an inclusive, fair, and just future for everyone. Tonight, we are thrilled and very fortunate to hear from Dr. Brenda Gunn, a professor of law at the University of Manitoba, who will be addressing the topic of Indigenous legal rights. The focus of her discussion will be on UNDRIP, treaty rights, and the TRC's calls to action. On behalf of Lieutenant Governor Neville and all of us at Government House, thank you, Dr. Gunn, for sharing your time and joining us this evening. Thank you to the team, Sandra and her team at National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, who have worked with us over the past few months to make this all possible. And again, on behalf of her honor, your desire to listen and learn by being here tonight. Thank you.
Tanse Kiawao, Vedagandish Nikashon, En Michif Nia, Winnipeg Ochinia, Maprenti Kaya. So much for joining me this evening and to have the opportunity to speak here at this place. And I'm going to share a little story that I wasn't actually going to talk about, but I have a 5-year-old. And so when I work in the evening, she's always a little bit annoyed. Mommy, where are you going? Okay, well, I have to go work. I have to do a talk this evening. And she was dropping me off. She's like, are you going to the Forks? And I'm like, no, I'm actually going to a building by the Golden Boy. And then I'm trying to tell her, I'm going to the house of the Lieutenant Governor. And then I was like, it's not until the words come out of your mouth that the sort of reality of Canadian democracy comes out. Because she's been watching a lot of Princess Diaries, if any of you remember that 90s movie. So I'm going to the house of the permanent representative of the king. And it's like, we aren't a fairy tale, right? So it's just this sort of moment in time where my work focuses so much on educating people and talking about the place that Indigenous peoples have in Canadian democracy. And I do so much work in advocating and working with governments that then there's this moment of, oh yeah, there is a king, right? And he may not be my bestie and I may not get to see him that often, but that is part of our structure. And so for me, it was a real awakening and reminder that that is part of our tradition, right? That it's not just the past. And you know, we can get into what are the constitutional powers of the Lieutenant Governor and what is the role, and we could get into these deep thoughts, but it was a really funny moment of just sort of like, you know, yeah, I'm going to the representative of the king, right? And so it's an interesting place to start today's conversation, right? When we think about moving forward and reconciliation and what does it look like. And so what I want to do today in the time that I have is make it through all of these items, just a small list. I've had lots of coffee, so we can just go really fast, and you know, I hope you're with me and bright-eyed and making it through. No, in all seriousness, I will try my best to walk us through some of the topics. They're clearly not going to go in depth to all of these items, but I want to more than sort of teach you everything there is to know about each of these items, treaty rights, the UN Declaration of Calls to Action. I want to more think about how do these items weave together. In particular, what I want to talk about and what I want to help us understand is how does an UN, an international human rights instrument, help us on our reconciliation journey? Because I think that is not normally what people think of when they think reconciliation. They don't think, we need human rights, right? That's not the key. So what I want to work through is how how might we think and work with human rights to support reconciliation? And now I forgot a remote, so I'm going to be jumping in and out. This is why I have the talk show host mic tonight. So I'm also not tall enough to just stay down there, I think. So what brings us here? You know, I've been doing this work on international Indigenous rights for a couple of decades. And in the late 2000s, early 2010s, no one really cared. It was going around talking about the UN Declaration and that we need to implement it, and people are like, it doesn't matter, I don't care. And it's been a huge shift, and shockingly so in my career, to see a place where lawyers and judges and people were like, no, it doesn't matter, to a place where I have 5 presentations on it this week. So people want to know, and I think a big part of why UNDRIP is part of what people are wanting to learn comes back to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action. One of the first ones that I really want to highlight is 43, where the Truth and Reconciliation Commission called on the government to implement the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. So it was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that really is pushing us to see human rights as that pathway. Everyone wants to know, well, how do we get to reconciliation? What do we need to do? The TRC told us the answer is in the UN Declaration. That's what we need to do. And so as part of that, many calls to action, and I didn't put in all the numbers, I just put many, call for education on a range of topics, because as this whole series is premised upon, education is key step towards reconciliation. It's not the end point. Knowing information and re-educating ourselves is an important first step, not the last one. But so we need to learn about Aboriginal people. We need to know about the history and legacy of residential schools. We need to know about the UN Declaration. And it is this point where the TRC called for lawyers and doctors and nurses and librarians and archives and churches and journalists and business and all government employees to learn about UNDRIP, that people are really picking this up now and wanting to learn, well, what is the UN Declaration and how can we use it? And so that has been really the focus of my work over the past couple of years, is helping various audiences understand what this instrument is. Sure, if you would love that. I'm feeling even more talk show hosty when I can then say, lovely assistant, next slide, please. Thank you. What's your name? Corinne. Hi, thank you so much. I was just going to use this as my step count for today, but it's probably a lot less dizzying for people if I stand still. That was the feedback in law school. When I was mooting, I was told to stop moving so much and just to stand still. And so I will be more focused. Thank you very much. So if we want to use the UN Declaration towards reconciliation, I think we need to have an understanding of what reconciliation is. And I'm sure many of you have come to tonight with an idea, and maybe you've attended other learning events where people have told you. There's not a single answer to this, despite there being a single phrase on the slide. I'm not sure there's a single right answer. There may or may not be wrong answers. I haven't quite decided if there's wrong answers, but there's reconciliation that happens on many levels, and I'm sure people have talked about this, individual level, community level, but what I like to focus on as someone that comes to this work from the law, from human rights, is that sort of larger systemic nation-to-nation kind of reconciliation. And so the Truth and Reconciliation then Commission said reconciliation is about establishing and maintaining a mutually respectful relationship. So reconciliation is about relationship building. In places like Manitoba, where we have historic treaties, there is perhaps a basis for a relationship, and we're working towards a future better relationship. But that's what we're talking about. And I think this is really critical, because when I think of a relationship, I don't think of assimilation, right? So this is where I was saying maybe there's not a wrong answer. Well, if your idea of reconciliation is fully assimilating Indigenous peoples into the mainstream and taking away status of Indigenous peoples and sort of making everyone the same and treating everyone the same, that to me is not reconciliation. That's the assimilative goal that we started with in the residential schools and all of those areas. Reconciliation has to be something different. So what we're told is it's a mutually respectful relationship where we respect our differences and we allow our differences to flourish, and we can live among one another despite differences. So if that's our idea, if that's our goal, how do we get there, and how does the UN Declaration help? Next. So the UN Declaration is a resolution of the UN General Assembly. So we want to use it as a framework. Let's understand what it is. A resolution of the UN General Assembly. The UN General Assembly is that place in New York where each country of the world has a single seat and gets a vote. And every country has one seat and one vote on the matters that come before it. It is also the highest deliberative body of the United Nations. So, by being a resolution of the General Assembly, it means it's that highest level agreement among states that the rights that are set out in the UN Declaration represent the rights of Indigenous peoples as we understand them. So a little bit of technical law. I wouldn't be doing a good job as a law professor if I didn't teach a little bit of law. I know it's late in the evening, so I'll keep it light and short. But the UN Declaration is different than a human rights treaty. So for those of you who may have worked in the area of human rights or have heard about human rights, there's a whole range of human rights treaties that exist in the UN. They deal with civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights and racial discrimination and the rights of women and children. Those treaties, Canada was part of the negotiations, and when the treaty was all done being negotiated, Canada then had to sign it and ratify it and deposit that signature back to the UN. And then Canada had to come home and pass legislation to implement it or point to legislation that's implementing it. That's what a treaty is. A declaration is different. A declaration comes into force with that vote. So that picture up there is the General Assembly Hall, and on the screens beside you can see a bunch of green writing. And if you have really good eyes, you can see that beside that writing is a bunch of squares. Most of them are green, some of them are yellow, and there's 4 red dots. So this is the actual vote. And I like to make an analogy to legislatures or the parliament, right? So if the Manitoba legislature, I'm a little turned around that way. Yeah? Okay. Oh, thank you. Ooh, good guess. If the Manitoba legislature is debating a piece of legislation and it comes to a vote, many times, it goes from first, second, third, final vote, and if it passes, it comes into force. You don't get to say, ha ha ha, my MLA voted against it. This law doesn't apply here in Southwood, right? It doesn't matter. Your vote no longer matters. That's the same thing with a resolution. The fact that Canada pushed the red button on the desk, because it's literally you vote by pushing a red, yellow, or green button. The fact that Canada pushed a red button has no legal significance of its implications here in Canada. We lost. They were unsuccessful in convincing the rest of the world to vote no. The majority voted yes. A few countries abstained. Canada, Australia, US, and New Zealand, or the Kansas states, nice acronym there for us, voted no. But because most voted yes, it passed, and the UN Declaration entered into force and became part of international law September 13th, 2007. So we've had quite a bit of time, actually. So despite Canada making sincere efforts today, it took us a long time to get going. So the flip side to all of this is, because it's a declaration, it's not directly enforceable. That means I can't go to the Manitoba courts, which are also that way, and say, I want to sue the government because they violated the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The enforcement is a little bit different. So that's another way that human rights treaties would be different from the UN Declaration. And if there's people in the crowd that really want to get into some of the nitty-gritties, I can talk later about how you can use it in law. But what we do know for sure is that Canada, as a member of the United Nations, is required to uphold all. Tonight? No? No one has troubles falling asleep? No? Okay. Next slide, please. So just a little bit of a recap, a restatement. So the UN Declaration is a human rights instrument. It took over 25 years, I often say 30 years, to negotiate through various UN bodies. Indigenous peoples were actively involved at every step of the way. This, I can tell you and guarantee you, the UN Declaration was not the idea of states. There was not a single state that said, I have a great idea. Let's spend our time and resources and try to talk about Indigenous peoples' rights. It was Indigenous peoples pushing and fighting the whole way and being part of that conversation, ensuring that there was never going to be a point where states defined our rights for us. Even if the technical rules didn't allow us in the room, we had worked long enough with states that they were engaging with Indigenous peoples and with the Indigenous caucus outside of the room and relaying that inside. And the states that we had been working with knew that there was no way you could vote for the declaration if Indigenous peoples weren't on side. So there are 24 preambular provisions, 46 articles. So the preamble is that opening part to the declaration. It starts with an italicized word. That preamble sets the context. Lots of people like to skip it and get right to the meat of the articles, the rights, the numbered paragraphs. The preamble is really important because it gives us that lens. It helps us understand what we're doing. And I think big picture, why the UN Declaration, what does it give us? It's about the minimum standards for the survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. What are we trying to do? Why do we have an instrument? It's about protecting the dignity and well-being and survival of Indigenous peoples. It's a way to respond to all of the efforts of the government and law to erase us from the landscape. We are now coming back and identifying those minimum efforts that need to happen to ensure that we get to continue to live in this place called Canada with dignity and our own well-being. And so part of interpreting the UN Declaration is not, I'm really sorry, you can't just read one paragraph. You have to read the whole thing. You have to understand how articles work together. You have to understand how the right to life works with the right to lands, territories, and resources, and how that works with the right of women and men and gender diverse persons to have human rights. It all works together. And we read the UN Declaration not just in itself. Now here's more homework. You have to read all of international human rights law. You got to read the whole 30 years of studies. Well, no, we can probably find a few resources that bring that together for you. But at least for lawyers and judges that are trying to use this, we don't just get to make up an interpretation. We don't say, oh, free, prior, and informed consent. I read those words. I know what it means. Understand the 30 years of jurisprudence from human rights bodies around the world that have helped identify and define what free, prior, and informed consent is. And I think, again, why do we want to do this? The power of UNDRIP. It provides a clear path for a more explicit recognition and application of Indigenous peoples' own laws in Canada. So part of what UNDRIP is doing then is making space and pointing Canada back to Indigenous peoples' own laws to understand this sort of minimum standard. Next slide. Okay, so what I want to go through now in my bit of time remaining, not helpful to look at the time when you can't remember when you started. Yeah. Okay, there we go. Okay, so why does UNDRIP matter? One of the things I've been thinking about and reflecting on, because now I get to do so many presentations, I went from no one listening to me to everyone wanting a little piece. So, but people now, for better or worse, are just accepting, okay, we got to know about UNDRIP, we got to do UNDRIP, let's do UNDRIP. But I like to be more intentional about things. I want to do UNDRIP not because someone told me to, maybe I'm a little, you know, rebellious Métis at heart that I'm not just going to do what people tell me to do. I want to know why. I want to do UNDRIP if I think it's going to be a useful tool. So why do I think UNDRIP matters? I think it's helpful because it promotes reconciliation, it recognizes Indigenous sovereignty, and it addresses the historic and ongoing harms of colonialism. So that's why I think we focus some of our efforts on UNDRIP and why we've included UNDRIP in this series. Next slide, please. Okay, so I already had the big point up here, and it got even bigger, I think. That's not for greater emphasis, that's just how formatting works. What I want us to think about now is, if this is our goal, if this is what reconciliation, how do we get there? And you might need really good eyes to see the smaller print now. But the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said, how do we get to reconciliation? How do we establish this mutually respectful relationship? We have to reject the paternalistic and racist foundations as the ongoing basis of a relationship. If you want a good, healthy relationship, it can't be based on racist doctrines like the doctrine of discovery. We can't continue to live in a myth that the treaties that were signed in this area ceded and released and surrendered the lands to the crown. We know that's false. People will say that, but no one yet is doing the work to say, and something new. Reconciliation requires a commitment to mutual respect. I think respect is on that one-to-one level, but also on that nation-to-nation level. So we respect one another's decisions. May not be the decision we'd make, but we respect those decisions. We respect the differences that come through. Creating a mutually respectful relationship requires that we support Aboriginal people as they heal from the destructive legacy of colonialism. Yes, this has an individual aspect. There have been many heal our nations, our governance, revitalize our laws, ensure that our ways of engaging in parenting and family structures is wholesome again. And so doing all this means that we need to transform Canadian society, right? How do we get to reconciliation? This is where I think it can get a little scary. I'm really sorry, it's not a little tweak. We're not mostly okay and just need a little here, there. It's transformational. And while status quo can be comfortable and change can be scary, the transformation that the TRC was calling for is one where all of our children and grandchildren live together in dignity, peace, and prosperity on these lands we now share. So I don't think it should be scary. That should be a vision of transformation that we can all get behind. I really hope everyone in this room and in the virtual rooms are sitting here going, yes, I do want a world where my children and my grandchildren have the same opportunities and same lifespans and same experiences in the education and healthcare and justice system as everyone else, as Indigenous peoples. I want to know my little girl, who right now is so proud that she can speak Cree. She knows about 30 words, and we learn via TikTok at night before bed. And she's super proud. She wants to teach her grade 1 teacher. She's decided that at her birthday party this year in December, she wants to have her teach her friends how to sing happy birthday in Cree, and that's how she wants. I can only hope that this is the pride that she has at 12 and at 15 and 20. I'm hoping that this world, this place that we live in South Osborne, I'm hoping that this world is one that continues to boost her up. Her grandma didn't teach her dad Cree after residential school. He has taught her the few words he has known. We have to find other sources, right? So this vision of transformation, maybe it's not fully known, but it's a destination I think we all want to get to. And I don't think there's any reason why we should be afraid of it, because you might lose something, right? If there are people that aren't having those same opportunities, that don't have that, I don't think we can enjoy what we have, right? That comes at a cost. So what we're talking about is knowing, identifying those racist foundations, addressing them, working together in a respectful way where we truly respect one another, not in a paternalistic fashion, but we agree, where we create space for Indigenous peoples to heal, and we transform Canada to actually be the place that we always say we're going to be. All those beautiful words at the beginning of our Constitution, this vision of this loving, open, welcoming, friendly Canada that is so kind that we say sorry to everything, right? Let's actually think about, how do we live that? How do we make this happen? Next slide, please. So enter in UNDRIP again. So how is a human rights instrument gonna get us there? The preamble. Remember I said those were important. Here are 4 opening paragraphs from the preamble that tell us that, I think show us how human rights can help us with reconciliation and how it can be a framework or the path to reconciliation. Because the very first thing it does is affirm that Indigenous peoples are peoples. And while I'm hoping that most people in this room, that is not a groundbreaking statement, I'm hoping that all of you recognize the humanity of every Indigenous person you see in person or on TV. This also means we recognize the humanity of Indigenous peoples in law. And we, again, it points us, if we want to recognize that Indigenous peoples are peoples, we have to address all of the ways in which Canadian law and Canadian sovereignty has been built on racist ideas of Indigenous peoples not being peoples. Right? So we are starting with that place of strength, recognizing the beauty of our cultures and our ways of knowing and being. We're not saying others have to follow them, but we respect the beauty that it is for our ways of being. And we recognize that colonization has had a negative impact. Here again, we see moments of sort of white fragility, or people want to say, well, it wasn't me, I didn't do it, I'm not a government, I'm not a police, I'm not this, right? This is about recognizing that even if you had good intentions, and even if an individual teacher was a good person, it was a genocidal system, right? It's not about individual blame, it's about that larger system. So we are recognizing that the way in which Canada was created, while we have this myth, this story of this wonderful settlement of coming in, and think of all those history books, this beautiful story about how Canada came to be, we need to start looking beneath that and recognizing the violence that happened underneath. And we don't stop there. We don't get stuck in that place of guilt or that feeling of like, oh, I don't want to admit it. How do we do that? We move on. And I think this is what is really key. The United Nations is convinced that the recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples will enhance harmonious and cooperative relations. Because what it's going to do is it's going to shift our relationship with the government from the colonial one where the government makes decisions for Indigenous peoples and not good decisions for us. I can point to many, many examples where those decisions have not been good for us. And we recognize now that the government should not be making decisions for Indigenous peoples, that we should be making decisions for ourselves, and we are fully capable of making decisions, and we might stumble, we may make bad decisions. Canadian government hasn't made many bad decisions. We respect the right of Indigenous peoples to govern ourselves and make those decisions to the best of our wisdom. And so we start shifting the relationship from the colonial one, the assertion of sovereignty, the assertion of jurisdiction and authority over peoples, to stepping back and realizing that what we need to do is recognize and build a relationship based on human rights, upholding all of the rights in the UN Declaration. And therefore, we have a relationship now based on human rights, on justice, on non-discrimination, on good faith. Right? So those values that Canadians espouse, if we work to implement the rights in the UN Declaration, we actually get to live that vision. Because what we do is we say, yes, we recognize that you are people and you have human rights. And every time you or anyone in your life questions and says, I don't know, maybe I can go with that right to language, but I don't know about this right, what that message is, I don't know if they're human and I don't know if they should have human rights. That is, in a sense, what you are saying if you're questioning the rights, is you're questioning the humanity. You're coming back here and saying, well, when we said peoples, we didn't mean that. Right? It's about shifting that relationship and setting out new foundations. And it also means that we come to accept the fact that having different people in Canada with differences is not a weakness. It's actually part of our strength. And we're actually a country that's really well positioned for this. Right? We already have a province that uses a completely different legal system than the rest of Canada. As a common law lawyer, I can tell you, I have no idea how the civil law works. Like, cannot wrap my head around it. And that's fine. Like, Quebec gets to do their thing. They also speak a language I don't really speak. It's fine. We are okay. I am okay here, right? So we already have this structure built into Canada to allow for differences. That's all we're simply doing, is continuing to say, we respect your right as people to make your own decisions, and we can continue to live side by side, and we are not going to continue to force our ways on you. And so implementing the UN Declaration then is something that we do in a spirit of partnership and mutual respect. Canadian governments cannot go out and do it themselves. They cannot define the rights and then say, this is what we think the right to self-determination is, and so this is what we're going to protect. That does not sound like we're moving away from colonialism, right? That's, again, oh, who knows best, right? So we're talking about some fundamental shifts. So in Manitoba, I would be remiss if I didn't talk a little bit about treaties, and I think it was one of the titles and one of the things I was supposed to talk about in my time. So really great vision, really great path forward, but we need to remember that in Manitoba we have a foundation, and those are the treaties, right? And so the Truth and Reconciliation Commission said it's important for all Canadians to understand that without treaties, Canada would have no legitimacy as a nation. Treaties between Indigenous nations and the Crown established the legal and constitutional framework of this country. And Elder Fred Kelly from Treaty 3, he says if reconciliation is to be real and meaningful in Canada, it must embrace the inherent right of self-determination through self-government envisioned in the treaties. So as we move forward in Manitoba with reconciliation, we have to start with the treaties. Where there have been treaties signed between Indigenous peoples and the Crown, we start there. But again, we need to ensure that these treaties are living agreements and help us move forward. They can't be holding us back. We can't, again, limit things. We start there, and we use the UN Declaration to help us understand what some of those treaty promises and what that relationship is going to look like. Next slide. Okay. The next reason that the UN Declaration matters and is useful, it's helping us with reconciliation. It's setting out a framework. It's helping us understand how we get this new relationship. And so as Elder Fred Kelly says, it has to start with self-determination. And so the UN Declaration is really significant because it starts by recognizing that we're peoples and nations. And so I use the word sovereignty because this is the word that I hear many of the elders and leaders use, that Indigenous nations are nations, we're sovereign nations. And I think that means we have the ability to govern ourselves and make decisions regarding our lands. And so we start by recognizing then, when you look at the UN Declaration and more of those preambular paragraphs and everything else, you can see that when Europeans arrived, we were nations. We had government systems, we had legal systems. There wasn't a legal vacuum in Canada. If you were to peel back Canadian law, it's not that there'd be no law here. There would be Indigenous laws, because there has always been Indigenous peoples with laws that have been operating in these territories. We had languages and spirituality, education systems, healthcare systems. We were full nations. And that's the foundation for the UN Declaration, right? So it's recognizing that sovereignty. It's also important to note then that this sovereignty of Indigenous nations was actually recognized in international law in the 1800s when the treaties were signed here. It wasn't until the very late 1800s and early 1900s that international law started taking away and shifting to not recognize the nationhood of Indigenous peoples. So when we talk about recognizing Indigenous nationhood today, it's not necessarily a new concept. It actually was our starting point. We just got a little off course for a while. And so the work of recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, including the right to self-determination then, means that we have to address the many myths and stereotypes that is working to undermine Indigenous people's nationhood. And this operates in so many ways. One of the examples that I often think about is the way in which the intergenerational impacts of residential school has impacted the education levels and the economic opportunities for Indigenous peoples, as well as personal trauma. And so the fact that many of our communities have high rates of poverty and substance use, and intergenerational impacts of residential school is now the reason that our children are being taken away, right? So this sort of myth that we're bad parents, no, there was a system designed. It's nothing inherent in us. The system is designed to set up and create this. So thinking about all of the ways that myths and stereotypes, and to this point, it's also a stereotype that Indigenous peoples are all traumatized and we're all trauma, right? So part of what has happened is almost a pendulum swinging in stereotypes with education around the history, as we've gone from sort of not knowing much to now sort of a new stereotype coming through that we're all trauma. And so part of what we need to do in recognizing Indigenous sovereignty is addressing those stereotypes. And again, I think that happens when you look at the UN Declaration and we think about Indigenous peoples and all of the areas in which we are able and capable of making decisions for ourselves. And again, I know sometimes the term Indigenous sovereignty can be scary. Sometimes I don't use it in presentations because I think sometimes people sort of turn around, turn off, or go, oh, sovereignty, it can't be sovereign. Canada is sovereign. Indigenous peoples aren't sovereign, and they sort of lose the ability. But I think it's worth sort of pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone and starting to think about, well, what does sovereignty mean, and why might I hold back from it? And so I wanted again to remind us that this idea of sovereignty is not new, that when treaties were negotiated here in Manitoba, Britain, coming with a strong tradition of making treaties, having engaged in the process for hundreds of years in Europe, had a process. They knew how to make treaties. But when they came here, they didn't bring their ways. They followed Indigenous people's ways of treaty making. That's why the pipe was smoked. That's why the gifts were exchanged. That's why treaty negotiations played out how they did. So that recognition, when you go somewhere else and you follow someone else's laws and legal processes, that's a recognition of their sovereignty, right? Because you're saying, I'm somewhere else, I'm gonna, do what you say. And so we've recognized that sovereignty. Again, we fell off the path somewhere, to say the least. But I think it's also worth reminding us of what was the relationship that was initially envisioned, right? And this is where Elder Darcy Linklater, he speaks about Wekotowin, and about at the time of treaty making, the Queen adopted us as her children to protect us and care for us. The establishment of kinship is to journey with one heartbeat, with one body and one mind, as long as the water flows. And this idea of building a relationship is really fundamental in Kriya Nihithoak worldviews, right? That the whole language is structured around relationships. And so one example that's been shared with me is that, mother, father, grandfather aren't nouns in Cree, they're actually verbs. So it's an action. And the language itself, people, maybe have heard of gukum or kukum, sometimes people say a harder K, as grandmother. Traditional language speakers will say it's not kukum, that's your grandmother. Nukum is my grandmother, because you don't just have a grandmother out there. A grandmother is a relationship. A grandmother is a grandmother because they have grandchildren, right? So it's about a relationship. And I've been told that children are the most special. In fact, I was taught that children are so special that when they are born, their feet are not to touch the ground, that they are so close to the Spirit as they are coming down. And so that children are held for the first year or two of their lives, and their feet do not touch the ground until they're ready to start walking. And then ceremony happens to ensure that when the little one touches the ground, that they are walking in a good way and they have the protection of their ancestors. So children are not sort of the property of their parents as it might have been viewed in Western ways at the time of treaty making. So when you talk about taking us as a children, you're talking about them having the most special responsibility and a reciprocal relationship. And so this is what was envisioned. And even some words by Morris, who is one of those pictures up there, by the way. I don't know if I've ever done a presentation where I can point to Morris. He also said that the Queen, though she may think it good for you to adopt civilized habits, has no idea of compelling you to do so. So the words of the Crown's negotiator also said, we're respecting your ways, those ways that we have come to the table and followed. We are not going to compel you. Those were the promises made. And so that is the relationship, and that's what sovereignty is about, is that we're not making decisions for one another, but we're living together and being family. Next slide. And so the UN Declaration then addresses the historic harm. So all of the challenges that we have in Manitoba, all of the what are we going to do if not our colonial ways, the UN Declaration then talks about self-government. What does that look like? It talks about Indigenous peoples' rights to lands, territories, and resources, and talks about how we can live together on these lands we now share. It talks about economic development. It talks about child welfare. It talks about healthcare. It talks about justice. So if we want to know how to move forward, we accept those human rights, and by accepting and working to implement those human rights, it helps us shift that relationship and have a new relationship moving forward. And so the UN Declaration really does have a whole range of rights. It really, those 46 articles are pretty comprehensive, so they're pretty dense, but they address equality, non-discrimination, self-determination, Indigenous people's own institutions, our rights to education, our rights to media and to be accurately reflected. There's a right in the UN Declaration that talks about the rights to have public information accurately reflect our own aspirations, right? So we have a right to have ourselves be appropriately represented in public information. Next slide. And so there have been many myths that have come out. I think I've addressed all of these. I'm going to just focus on this simply aspirational one. This idea of the UN Declaration being aspirational came from former Prime Minister Harper, and I continue to hear it. It is one of his biggest legacies. I don't know if he knows this, but it's so funny to me that we would talk about, oh, those human rights aren't binding. We don't have to do them. We just simply aspire to those human rights, right? Like once we remember that we're talking about the human rights of people, when we start using those words, it sounds kind of crazy. And I get this come back to me all the time. Like everyone knows this phrase. And if I can ask one thing, throw it out. Throw out this idea that we simply aspire to human rights, but we don't have to do them. If that's the Canada we are, it's not the Canada I want to be in. I want to do more than simply aspire for human rights. And I think that's what our charter is kind of about. Next slide. And so one of the things that, and I think I'm close to the end here, one of the things I do want to let us all know is that in Manitoba, we have another foundation for implementing the UN Declaration. There's the Path to Reconciliation Act. Does anyone know this legislation? Yeah, awesome. So back, I can't even remember the year. I need to do some math in my head. Government of Manitoba committed to reconciliation to be guided by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action and the principles in the UN Declaration. We already said we were going to do it. So there's nothing holding us back, but maybe political will. We have a foundation. We know we need to do it. We know it helps us get there. So while we don't need legislation to implement the UN Declaration in Canada, that's not how it works. We already do have something in law that has not been repealed that's saying this is what we're going to do. So I feel like let's just get on and do it. Next slide. And so I just want to end today by asking you all to think about what can you do professionally and personally to promote reconciliation, and how does UNDRIP fit into your work? And I don't mean work as like paid work that you go to, the work that is your life's path. And so how does this fit into, I guess I could say your life, but I feel like a life of service and work, either directly or the work underneath it. We all have communities that we are part of. And so that's my presentation. Thank you so much for your time.
I used the term dynamic earlier on, and I think she really hit the mark on that. So much education there, and a wonderful, wonderful entry into this, the whole topic, really. On that note, I know we're a little bit late on time, but I do want to save a little bit of time for Q&As. So we do have a few moments for one or two questions, so I'll invite you to maybe show a hand, and the other eight at the cab, Corey can walk over with the mic and allow you to pose your question. So who would like to bring something forward? Thank you in the front row.
Surprise, surprise. I think it's maybe more of a comment, but I wasn't personally aware of it being Harper specifically who promoted that simply aspirational notion that's out there. But I feel it's worth all of us knowing as well that in 2021, Canada on a national level did sign into law a bill that Canada is bound to honor and uphold UNDRIP as well with a national action plan. So we have very specific national level aspirations as well that are very directly actionable. So that might be good for us to know when we hear that out in the wild.
Yeah, and I didn't include it in this presentation, but the Federal UN Declaration Act does confirm that the UN Declaration is part of Canadian law, and it requires the government to take action to ensure that Canadian laws are consistent with the UN Declaration, and they're to do this in consultation and coordination, I think is the phrasing, with Indigenous peoples. And so that work is being undertaken. Questions do arise whether that requires the provincial level, like the law that they pass over there, to comply. But I think what we are seeing increasingly from the courts is the impact of that federal legislation, how courts are dealing with it, is they're starting to say, Canada, you've said you endorsed it. Canada, you said it means it's a full box of rights. Canada, if you're saying that, we're gonna hold you to it. And so I think it's going to be harder and harder for governments who have expressed support to do UNDRIP to then go to court and say, oh wait, we didn't mean we wanted it enforced on us, right? Not those human rights, we meant the other ones, right? So I do think we have seen significant movement, particularly even this year in the courts.
Thank you very much. You've made very enlightening, some very complicated concepts. It's been very interesting. Thank you. Given the importance of land to Indigenous peoples, my question relates to processes that happen at the federal level. So relating to impact assessment that the government is required to carry out on development projects. So like a dam is going to be built, or a highway, or mining, or something. And environmental impacts are required to be conducted. Internationally, there's been some progress in applying a human rights framework to those impact assessments, and I'm wondering if the new legislation federally has moved us any closer in that direction, in your opinion?
In words, yes. In practice, we're still figuring out what it means. But I want to take your question a little bit further in thinking about how implementing UNDRIP in Canada and in Manitoba could impact how we assess projects. So much ado about free, prior, and informed consent, and so many people are worried about Indigenous peoples getting to consent, or then this concern that we would have a veto and block progress or block economic development. But to remind us that lens that I brought at the beginning, the UN Declaration is about the minimum standards to protect the human rights, survival, and dignity and well-being of Indigenous peoples. That's what we've committed to. And I'm really, really sorry if our survival and well-being means that we need to take a different approach to economic development. It's not that most First Nations are saying no development anywhere, anytime. What I've heard is no development without us getting benefits because we are impacted. I've heard no development here because this is where our ancestors live, right? The Sichak-Anawaki, sometimes the Oka crisis, what it's known as. They wanted to build a friggin' golf course on in a graveyard where their ancestors are. I'm pretty sure everyone in this room, if I tried to put a golf course where your grandparents are, you wouldn't just say, sure, I like to golf, right? Because that is such a horrific idea, right? So we say, no, not here. Sometimes we also say, no, that's a terrible idea. There was an idea in Ontario years ago when I was articling where they were trying to move away from coal, and so they were gonna try to mine all the peat moss off of the Canadian Shield and burn that, the pre-coal. What a terrible, stupid idea, right? So sometimes we also say no. Like, it takes so long. I don't know if anyone spends time on the Canadian Shield, but that bit of peat moss, like, takes a long time to grow, and it's gonna burn really fast. Like, you are gonna clear a whole ecosystem to power, right? Like, there are better ideas, right? So I've also heard no's where there's just not good ideas, or projects that just aren't feasible, right? Sometimes Indigenous people say, you wanna build a road there? Anyone ever take the train up north? Right? What happens when you build a train track over a bog? It moves, right? So sometimes we also say, that's not a good idea. Like, that's not gonna work the way you think it's going to work. So when we talk about using UNDRIP in these ways, it's about making sure that development and the ideas that we have that's gonna benefit Canada is not gonna benefit Canada to the detriment of Indigenous peoples. And to further note, to make it a little bit more extreme, the research is abundantly clear that the man camps that are created around development projects are one of the leading causes for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. This is internationally known. The World Bank now requires safety audits and safety plans for women for the creation of projects, because these projects create such a severe safety risk, right? So what we're saying is we no longer want to pay the price with our lives for Canada's economic well-being, which shouldn't be that much to ask.
Great answer. So we will take that one last question. I know there might be more. Perhaps we can convince Dr. Gunn to take personal questions afterwards, but we'll have this last question before we end.
That was a terrific presentation, and the answers to the questions terrific as well. My question is, you made clear that Indigenous is not defined in the Declaration, and we have great interest in our world right now. For example, are the Palestinian people Indigenous? Are the Jewish people Indigenous? Are the people in Africa, in all of the different countries of that continent, Indigenous, and so forth? I just wonder, how does one bring about clarity in that, and how is that happening?
Thank you. So the UN Declaration didn't define it for multiple reasons. One, it is a declaration coming out of the General Assembly, and there was an acknowledgement at the General Assembly define who is Indigenous, even if Indigenous peoples were involved, could be viewed as very colonial and paternalistic. Secondly, it had been studied. There are a lot of UN studies. There are very standard accepted definitions of who Indigenous peoples. That was the work sort of throughout the 80s at the Working Group on Indigenous Populations. So there's a very clear understanding in international law who is Indigenous. We, of course, also wanted to not close a definition and keep it open. And so some of the discussions around who is Indigenous, of course you must self-identify, but as we know, anyone following the news, self-identification is not enough. It's also about showing that colonial history. It's about having a special relationship to specific lands and having that connection. Being a nation also, right? So having a distinct culture and distinct language that is sort of different from those around. So there's that sort of element of difference. And so in the Manitoba context, Red River Métis, Manitoba Métis Federation, First Nations, Dene, Inuit, those have all been very accepted as Indigenous peoples. And I'm really sorry, I'm not going to wade into like one of the most contentious political issues. I also think, to what end are people claiming, and what does it help us answer, right? The challenges around the world are very significant. Oh, on the Africa point though, there was, before the release of the UN Declaration, the Kansas states were putting a lot of pressure on Africa, trying to say we're going to withhold aid if you vote in favor of the UN Declaration. This is how international politics works, for those of you who are interested. African countries were also concerned about who would be Indigenous. How do we sort of define this in the African context? So the African Commission for Human and People's Rights actually did a report on the idea of Indigenous peoples in Africa. So that's available on the African Commission for Human and People's Rights website. You can find that report, and it goes into more details. But there's Indigenous peoples recognized in the Arctic, in North America, in South America, Latin, in parts of Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and in the Pacific. I think I hit all the regions of Indigenous peoples as we understand them.
Well, Dr. Gunn, on behalf of Lieutenant Governor Neville, all the people in the audience, and of course those people watching live stream, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and providing that education to us. So thank you. In a few moments' time, I'll invite you all to carry on the conversation. I'm sure there's a lot of conversation to be had in light of what we've heard this evening, and you may do so as you enjoy some light refreshments in the room off to my right, your left, and I do hope you enjoy your time. I do want to advise, however, that the event will conclude at roughly 8:45. That'll give you enough time to have a little bit of the conversation, not a lot, but I will say this, if you don't have a watch, you can look over at myself or Corey to remind you of that time frame, so we can make sure to get you back home safely while there's still a little bit of light. Well, actually, no, the light's all gone now, isn't it? I will say that we will be there to remind you a little bit of that. If you are feeling that you are short of time, I do have something to offer you, and that is that we're able to welcome you back to Government House in a very short time. The next and final topic on this series, What is Reconciliation, is coming in just a little while. The talk is called Allyship in a Colonized Canada, and it will feature guest speaker Reverend Tanis MacLeod Kalinsky. And that event will be held on November 21st, 2024. The registration will open on November 7th, 2024 at 10 a.m. So I do encourage you to watch for that news release in order that you can book your seat for the final event of this series. Once again, I thank you all for your attendance this evening. It is always a pleasure to welcome you to Government House. I wish you all a wonderful time as you converse in the side room, and wish you also a pleasant evening. Oh, and before I do that, thank you for our technical support volunteer for coming forward. That was nice. Once again, thank you and have a good evening.